The Forgotten River, the eastern branch of the Potomac. These are all just a few names for the river we've come to know as the Anacostia. We, at Anacostia Riverkeeper, with the help of the District Department of Energy and Environment, would like to welcome you to the Anacostia and thank you for joining us out here on the river. These boat tours are funded by DOE through the Anacostia Cleanup and Protection Fund, via funds collected from the 5-cent bag fee in the District of Columbia. You can come along on these boat tours virtually, through videos like these, or in person when available in the spring, summer, and fall. And, as always, tours are offered free of charge to all DC residents and visitors. So let's head out on the river and see what the Anacostia has to offer. Let's take a trip back in time. We're 400 years in the past, floating down bluish-green Anacostia waters past what is now Anacostia Park. There are no roads or houses, no metro lines or bridges, only cliffs and wetlands on the eastern bank of a river that is 30 to 40 feet deep in some places. Thousands of shad swim beneath our boat, massive 12-foot sturgeon hide from sight, a bald eagle and an osprey duel over a catfish overhead. The Capitol building and Washington Monument are nowhere to be seen, only a pristine and thriving river ecosystem. This is the Anacostia River in its beautiful and unaltered state. We're now back in present day. The Anacostia River's main stem is 8.5 miles long and runs from its confluence with the Potomac River in DC to the south, all the way up to Bladensburg, Maryland in the north. The whole watershed, or area of land that drains into the main stem, is 176 square miles and comprises parts of Washington, D.C., Montgomery County, Maryland, and Prince George's County, Maryland. To put that into perspective, the whole Chesapeake Bay watershed is over 64,000 square miles. Almost 80% of the watershed lives within the state of Maryland, with Sandy Spring, Maryland, serving as the highest point in the watershed both geographically and in terms of elevation. With tributaries like Sligo Creek, the Northwest Branch, Lower Beaver Dam Creek, and many more, the Anacostia's water flow around much of what we call the Beltway region today. The Anacostia is a tidal freshwater river, with the entirety of the main stem lying in the coastal plain region, meaning that it is meant to be a wide, meandering, and slow-moving river. In fact, the average time it takes for water to travel the entire 8.5 miles of the main stem Anacostia is around 30 days, or one whole month. The Anacostia main stem typically experiences 2 high tides and 2 low tides a day, with a tidal range of around 3 feet. Over time, the Anacostia and its watershed have changed over the course of human history. It served as a home and the lifeblood of the local Piscataway people, the first human and indigenous inhabitants of much of the D.C. area, who the Anacostia is named after, and who are still active in the region and in the preservation of the Anacostia itself. The river has seen D.C. grow from a small collection of farms to the nation's capital we know today. The Anacostia has seen war, prosperity, development, and struggles for racial equality in the district. Its history is intertwined with those of presidents, local heroes, civil rights leaders, and people whose tireless effort helped build D.C. into what it is today. The Anacostia's environmental journey is equal parts neglect, displaying the true harm that humans can have on their environment, and redemption, as the recent resurgence of the Anacostia shows that the community effort and strong environmental protection practices can truly save a river at the edge of collapse. We've seen the disappearance of bald eagles due to pollution, as well as the return of our national bird thanks to mitigation efforts on the river. The Anacostia watershed even served as the home of Rachel Carson for a time, author of Silent Spring and the mother of the modern-day environmental movement. As a river, the Anacostia still faces threats from pollution, stormwater, trash, and a host of other environmental dangers. But DC and Maryland, with the help of community members and organizations like us at Anacostia Riverkeeper, are working together to fight these issues and ensure the Anacostia continues on its journey to a pristine ecosystem. On this boat tour, we'll introduce you to the true Anacostia that few rarely get to experience. We'll explore the whole main stem, from the bustling Navy Yard to the tranquil northern reaches of the Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens. We'll walk through the history of the Anacostia in the region, the environmental threats and issues that have plagued the river for years, efforts currently underway to further clean the river, and maybe see a river otter or two along the way. Now come on, and let's explore the Anacostia, our river, DC's river. We start our tour of the Anacostia at the end of its flowing waters, at the southern extent of the river as it flows into the Potomac River. The Anacostia River is one of the larger tributaries to the Potomac River, with the confluence, or the meeting point, of the two rivers occurring at Haines Point in Washington, D.C. This meeting of the two rivers illustrates just how important Anacostia River health is to the health of the Potomac, because everything that flows down the Anacostia will inevitably flow into the Potomac River and then down into the Chesapeake Bay. Haines Point and East Potomac Park play a special role in the Anacostia and DC history, as it's actually a man-made island that was built in tandem with the tidal basin in the late 1800s. It is named after Peter Conover Haines, who helped to design the tidal basin, as increasing floods, tidal flats, and rank smells from the wetlands were considered unsightly and dangerous to waterfront areas of DC. The channel that flows into the Anacostia just upstream of the confluence with the Potomac is called Washington Channel, and flows from the tidal basin, past the wharf and East Potomac Park, and eventually into the Anacostia at Haines Point, next to Fort McNair, which is located on Greenleaf Point. What's interesting about the tidal basin is that it was built to help drain the tidal flats along the Potomac and Anacostia. Now, water flows into the tidal basin from the Potomac and flows out into Washington Channel and the Anacostia as the tide drops. This mechanism helps the water in the tidal basin to move in and out, helping to filter it some, which is why we typically see some of the best water quality in DC along the tidal basin and Washington Channel. This area of Southwest has always been shaped by the rivers that flow along its banks. In 1805, at the wharf, the municipal fish market opened and is one of the longest operating fish markets in the United States. This area served as a home to many recently freed slaves moving into the district during and after the Civil War, as DC had work opportunities and was seen as a hub for abolitionists and civil rights leaders like Frederick Douglass and Mary Church Tyrrell. In 1848, the wharf was even the site of one of the largest and most daring escapes by slaves in the United States, with 77 slaves attempting to flee Washington and escape to freedom on board the ship the Pearl. The whole plan was even hatched by a former slave of President James Madison, Paul Jennings. Unfortunately, in the mid-1900s, misguided efforts towards redevelopment and urban renewal in the district forced many Southwest residents out of longstanding communities. Currently, the wharf has been redeveloped into DC's newest waterfront community, with the intention of eventually meeting with the Navy Yard further north to create an inclusive and connected Anacostia waterfront community. As we move further up the river towards the Frederick Douglass Bridge, we will pass Fort McNair on the west bank of the river and Joint Base Anacostia Bowling on the east bank of the river. The location where Joint Base Bowling now sits is believed to be one of the old locations for a large tribal village of the Nacotchtank people, one of the first indigenous inhabitants of DC who made their home along the Anacostia. English colonizers to the area called the Nacotchtank people the Anacostans, from which the Anacostia gets its current name. On the west bank of the river is Buzzard Point, home to DC United's new Audi Field, and future riverfront development. It also serves as the location for James Creek Marina, one of the few marinas on the Anacostia named after the old James Creek, a stream that used to flow through DC and enter the Anacostia nearby the current marina. Also located here is one of DC's Bandalong litter traps that was installed and is managed by us at Anacostia Riverkeeper. This floating device is installed at the mouth of the stormwater outflow, which allows it to capture and hold trash in place, preventing it from reaching the main stem of the actual Anacostia. This device is just one of a number of different ways that DC is preventing trash and debris from entering into its surface waters. Looking into the future, this southern portion of the Anacostia is going to serve as a centerpiece for climate resilience efforts on the river. This area has some of the lowest elevations in the watershed, and over time has experienced dramatic floods and is even starting to experience sunny day flooding or flooding due to extreme high tides. To combat this, DC has built a comprehensive climate plan that created more flood-aware building requirements and is researching new, nature-based solutions to mitigate some of the effects of increased flooding and rising waters. Solutions like living shorelines and other green infrastructure projects that work naturally with the natural environment to help reduce flooding in the area. As we pass under the South Capitol Street Bridge, or the Frederick Douglass Bridge as it's also called, we move from southwest DC into southeast DC, from Buzzard Point into the Navy Yard neighborhood, home to the Washington Navy Yard, Nationals Park, Yards Park, and many other restaurants and attractions. This is one of the fastest growing neighborhoods along the river. On the east bank of the river, as we move upstream, is the southern extent of Anacostia Park and a point jutting subtly into the river called Poplar Point. This area is interesting not only for the Anacostia Riverwalk Trail or the wild fox and turkeys you may see while exploring it, but because it has a long history shaped by the river. Poplar Point once housed old Navy greenhouses, nurseries for the architect of the Capitol, and, as some rumors say, once served as a target practice field for newly built Navy armaments built at the Navy Yard just across the river. Unfortunately, this past land use led to the leaching of toxics into the soil of Poplar Point, some of which, like metals and PCBs, are still present today, but being addressed under the district's comprehensive Anacostia River Sediment Project. Several other sites along this stretch of the river, like the Navy Yard itself, are also being addressed under this plan, which we'll talk about later on this tour. Behind Poplar Point lies the National Park Service headquarters for the National Capital Parks East, as well as one of the nests for the resident bald eagles along the Anacostia. On the east side of the river is Ward 8, eventually transitioning into Ward 7 further north along the river. Old Town Anacostia lies on the east bank of the river on the other side of the 11th Street Bridge as one of the longest standing communities in the DC area. It is where the abolitionist Frederick Douglass made his home on Cedar Hill, and where large communities of newly freed black slaves moved to when coming to the city post-Civil War, in communities like Berry Farm and Anacostia. The 11th Street Bridge marks the end of the Navy Yard on the west side of the river and holds a special place in DC history. At its current location, the 11th Street Bridge is one of the oldest bridges in DC, not in terms of the actual bridge itself, but where it currently sits, its footprint. Old versions of the 11th Street Bridge have come and gone, but it served as one of the original bridges, one of the main arteries linking communities in Maryland and Anacostia to the rest of DC. Interestingly enough, it is also the bridge that John Wilkes Booth escaped across after assassinating President Lincoln in 1865. In present day, it's the location of the new 11th Street Bridge project, which will be a separate, elevated pedestrian bridge adjacent to the 11th Street traffic bridge, which will provide space for education, entertainment, arts, and more importantly, safe access to either side of the Anacostia for pedestrians. With equitable access being a primary issue currently facing the river, this project will hopefully serve as a catalyst for building a more inclusive river community for all DC residents and visitors. The U.S. Navy Yard itself was built in 1799 and has the distinction of being the oldest shore-based naval installation in the United States. Its original purpose was to build smaller ships, armaments and weapons for ships, and general maintenance of Navy equipment. During the War of 1812, it was actually burned to the ground along with other parts of Washington, D.C. However, it was set afire due to an order from the US forces, as they did not want their weapons and munitions to fall into British hands. The White M Street Gate, or the Latrobe Gate as it's called, was one of the only original structures to remain standing after this burning. Today, it serves more as an administrative hub for the Navy, but is still an active military base and even has a museum on site that citizens can visit with valid government ID. Downriver from the Navy Yard is the new Riverside neighborhood with Yards Park, the Anacostia Riverwalk Trail, plenty of restaurants, and Nationals Park, home of the 2019 World Series champions, the Washington Nationals. The National Stadium helped kick off modern development around the Navy Yard in 2008 and actually does its own part in help protecting the Anacostia, as it was the first certified LEED green major sports stadium in the United States. Right next to Nationals Park is the new headquarters of DC Water, which is also a brand new LEED certified building that actually retains and uses all stormwater it generates on site. Next to the headquarters is one of the most distinctive buildings in the area, the O Street Pump House. This pump house is an important component of the DC sewer system in that it helps to pump wastewater away from the city down to the Blue Plains Wastewater Treatment Plant, which serves as the wastewater treatment plant for DC, parts of Maryland, and parts of Virginia. Around 1/3 of DC is served by what's called a combined sewer system, while the other 2/3 are served by the MS4 system, or the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System. Unfortunately, with the older and antiquated combined sewer system, DC still suffers from overextended sewer systems during large rainstorms, which can then trigger a combined sewer overflow. These overflows occur at physical points along DC's surface waters and can lead to raw sewage entering into our waters, which is why swimming in the district is actually illegal and has been since the 1970s. This being a public health issue, accompanied by high bacterial counts, has caused the district and DC Water to start the Clean Rivers program, which consists of new conveyance tunnels for sewage, as well as green infrastructure projects to help reduce stormwater impacts in the entirety of the city. It's the district's goal to reduce the amount of combined sewer overflows to the Anacostia by 98% and to all DC waters by 96% by 2030. As we move upriver, past the 11th Street Bridge, we are nearing the unofficial dividing line between the lower Anacostia and the upper Anacostia. The CSX Railroad Bridge that crosses the river serves as this dividing line, separating the more developed lower Anacostia from the less developed upper Anacostia, where less of the city can be seen and the river takes on a much more natural setting. As we move under and past the 11th Street Bridge, we come upon Boathouse Row, a stretch of the river housing some of the oldest marinas and boathouses in the district. On the west bank of the river, as we move upriver, we first see Eastern Powerboat Club, established in the early 1900s, then District Yacht Club, and then Washington Yacht Club. What's interesting about Washington Yacht Club is that the stories tell that on this stretch of the river, Washington Yacht Club, in its earliest form, used to have ferry services to either side of the river, helping folks move daily from the east bank to the west bank and back again. These boathouses are still active and some of the few places on the Anacostia where you can still store a boat for boating and leisure to move about the Anacostia and the Potomac. Just before Boathouse Row, on the west bank of the river, lies the old site of a Washington coal gas plant that used to provide heating and lighting gas for much of the southeast area of DC. Unfortunately, this plant produced an abundance of environmentally harmful pollutants and potentially toxic chemicals that are currently being investigated today under the Anacostia River Sediment Project. This plant is no longer active and was demolished in 1986. However, the site along the riverbank is still used by the Army Corps of Engineers to house their small fleet of specialized boats. These boats help to patrol the lower portions of the Anacostia and clear the river of any large trees or debris that can wash downstream or be brought into the river from the Potomac and high tides. If you take a stroll along the Anacostia Riverwalk Trail or come to visit the river, you may see yellow boats that kind of look like floating forklifts carrying large trees from the river, as this is one of the main jobs for the Army Corps of Engineers, is to help clear navigable waters and keep them navigable for boat traffic. Now if you look on the east bank of the river, towards Anacostia, you'll start to notice a pedestrian trail, sports fields, a giant pirate ship playground, and a large open-air skating rink. This is Anacostia Park. Along with Rock Creek Park, Anacostia Park is one of the largest park spaces and national parks in the district. In fact, Anacostia Park is even bigger than Central Park in New York City, as it runs almost the whole length of the Anacostia in DC, from Poplar Point all the way to around Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens near the DC-Maryland border. Now, first thing you may notice about the park is how flat it is. Almost suspiciously flat. There's only one animal on planet Earth that loves things this flat. That is the human being. The park is flat because it is man-made. Anacostia Park actually used to contain broad stretches of wetlands that ended in large riverside cliffs and bluffs that you may expect to see on the Potomac or the Bay, but you can actually see the old remnants of these high points in the high hills that lie just to the east of the river and actually mark the eastern extent of the Anacostia watershed in the district. Now, when we say this is Anacostia Park, we really mean it, as the park was made with dredged sediments from the river itself. Actual river bottom sediments are what make up Anacostia Park. The park was built in stages in the early 1900s, with the first construction starting around 1908, making Anacostia Park over 100 years old, a full century. It was modeled after East Potomac Park and was meant to fill in what were thought of as malaria-producing swamps, as we didn't know the many benefits that wetlands actually provide to both the river and the ecosystems surrounding it. Today, Anacostia Park is home to many attractions and services like the Anacostia Riverwalk Trail, fields and playgrounds, and one of the only open-air skating pavilions around. It is also home to the Aquatic Resources Education Center, which is managed by the staff from the District Department of Energy Environment. The AREC, as it's known, serves as an interactive natural and environmental museum and nature center for the river, where visitors and schools can come to learn more about the Anacostia itself, its ecosystems, and even see firsthand some of the wildlife that inhabit the river and its shores. If you're at Anacostia Park and look across the river, you may also see blue boats with what looks like conveyor belts patrolling the river. These boats are specially designed boats employed by DC Water to clean up and remove floatable trash from this lower portion of the river. Due to its urban and developed nature, the Anacostia River has an unfortunate issue with trash, as many have noted while spending time on the river. In fact, the Anacostia is one of the few rivers in the United States with what's called a total maximum daily load, or TMDL, for trash. This is essentially a pollution diet, meaning that Maryland and the District of Columbia are required to remove a certain amount of trash from the river each year. This is accomplished in a few ways. From on-land trash cleanups that we at Anacostia Riverkeeper run, to trash traps installed on the river, to these DC water boats. These boats run year-round and help to clean a lot of the floating trash that has come downriver to the lower portion of the Anacostia. Once a boat has circulated on a daily trash run, it returns to shore where the trash can be disposed of appropriately. Much like its cousin, Mr. Trash Wheel up in Baltimore's Inner Harbor, our Anacostia boats also have names, Flotsam and Jetsam. On average, these two boats will remove almost 400 tons of trash from the Anacostia each year. As we move past the Pennsylvania Avenue Bridge, or the John Philip Sousa Bridge as it's also called, we come to the final stretch of the lower Anacostia. On the east side of the river is still Anacostia Park, but also one of the few points on the river where you can actually put a boat in the water. Anacostia Park has one of the only docks and boat ramps on the Anacostia, and is the only one on the east side of the river. With equitable river access being a vital quality of an inclusive Anacostia, more access points like this on the east bank of the river are much, much needed. On the west bank of the river, are the Anacostia Community Boathouse and Seafarers Yacht Club. Anacostia Community Boathouse is the hub of watercraft recreation on the Anacostia, serving as the home to many crew teams, but also providing opportunities for DC residents and visitors to row themselves and even explore other clubs and craft like dragon boats or even outrigger canoes. Now, Seafarers Yacht Club is especially important to the Anacostia and DC history in general, as it was the first black yacht club in the United States. Organized by Lewis T. Green, a DC teacher and boat builder, he was looking for a place around the district to store his boat, but found no place that was available for the district's black residents. First, being mostly ignored by the Department of the Interior, it took the efforts of local leader Mary McLeod Bethune and assistance from First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt to make Seafarers Yacht Club, first known as Seafarers Boat Club, a permanent fixture on the Anacostia in 1945 and the United States' first black-owned and operated yacht club. As we pass below the CSX Railroad Bridge, we move from the lower Anacostia into the more natural and idyllic upper Anacostia. But be careful when you go under the bridge. Because of the rising and falling of the tides, some boats can only pass beneath the bridge at certain points, and some boats can't fit at all beneath it. While each section of the river has its own interest points along the river, the upper Anacostia is especially interesting as it's a section that not many people have experienced via boat or watercraft, and more resembles how the river would look in its natural state. The first thing you notice immediately when passing below the bridge is the sudden lack of visible development on the river. On the west bank is old RFK Stadium and the Kingman Park area of Southeast, as well as construction for the new Clean Rivers project. But other than that, not much of the city is visible from the river itself. As you move into this stretch of river, two structures do draw your eye on the western bank of the river. The first is a series of rectangular outfalls that mark the largest and most upstream combined sewer overflow, or CSO point, on the Anacostia, serving a large segment of Northeast. The second is a series of old concrete structures on the southern end of what is Kingman Lake and Kingman Island, the remnants of an old tide gate that used to help control water levels in Kingman Lake. In the past, this CSO was prone to overflow during large rain events, as stormwater landing on streets and buildings in Northeast flowed into the same pipes as sewage, triggering the need for an overflow into the Anacostia. Thankfully, as we talked about before, the district's Clean Rivers project aims to reduce combined sewer overflows into the Anacostia by 98% via two conveyance tunnels, the Anacostia Tunnel, completed in 2018, and the Northeast Boundary Tunnel, currently under construction and scheduled to be completed in 2023. At the old tide gate, we get our first glimpse of Kingman and Heritage Islands, as well as Kingman Lake. Kingman and Heritage Islands are man-made islands constructed much in the same way as Anacostia Park, by using Anacostia River sediments that were collected during periodic dredging of the river. The islands and the 110-acre Kingman Lake were completed in 1916. Over the years, an abundance of development and plans have been made for the islands. In the 1900s, it was proposed to turn the island into an airport, and the district even wanted to use the space as a potential landfill. In 1961, on the adjacent parkland, RFK Stadium was opened and would host many of the district's various sports teams. Langston Golf Course occupies much of the north end of Kingman Island and was constructed in the late 1930s and served as one of the first golf courses in the United States that was open to black golfers. Today, Kingman Island is property of the district and managed by the organization Living Classrooms. Unfortunately, Kingman Lake has a history of legacy toxins in the sediments themselves, like many areas of the river, but is currently being addressed under the Anacostia River Sediment Project, and will be one of the first locations remedied in the coming years. In 2018, Kingman Island was designated a state conservation area, further protecting it from any development and ensuring it serves as a true area of wilderness for DC residents and visitors to visit for years to come. It hosts many events throughout the year. most prominently the Kingman Island Bluegrass Festival, which has been drawing acts and visitors from across the East Coast for over a decade. In the future, it hopes to be a popular spot for all kinds of recreation, even potentially swimming when the swim ban in the district is eventually lifted in the future. As we move upriver towards the East Capitol Street Bridge, or the Whitney Young Bridge as it is also called, we move past many mudflats along the shoreline that resembles much of what the Anacostia used to look like due to the silting up of the river due to European settlement. You may also notice a seawall that runs along almost the whole length of the main stem and around Kingman Island. This was put into place in the early 20th century during the construction of Anacostia Park and its surrounding areas. Today it's in disrepair in some places and vulnerable to sea level rise, making some areas of the seawall potential locations for further green infrastructure and more natural shoreline stabilization techniques like living shorelines. On the west bank of Kingman Island and on the east bank just past the Whitney Young Bridge, we also come across some of the largest continuous stretches of wetland habitat on the main stem Anacostia. These wetlands were built in the past few decades by the Army Corps of Engineers, and you may notice metal sheeting just in front of the wetlands put there to help them grow, but also stabilize them in their current location. Native plants like wild rice, cattails, spatterduck, and many more were used to encourage and help native wildlife. Wetlands are vital not just to the Anacostia, but to any tidal or freshwater habitats that they may inhabit. Wetlands provide numerous ecosystem services to the Anacostia, such as filtering incoming water to the river, trapping and holding sediment, stabilizing the shoreline by growing outwards and upwards with any sea level rise, and providing a safe haven for many native species of fish and mammals, among many others. The Anacostia used to be covered in wetlands as far as the eye could see in many places. In the early days of English settlement of the area, travelers would come from as far as Europe and abroad for the sole reason to see some of the beautiful birds and wildlife that inhabited the wetlands of the Anacostia. Today's wetland habitats along the Anacostia are much smaller than they used to be. Thankfully, in recent years, there's been an increased emphasis placed on many benefits that wetlands provide, leading to many wetland plantings and revitalization projects around the district and Maryland in the Anacostia watershed. The Benning Road, or Ethel Kennedy Bridge, marks the end of this stretch of the river, as well as marking the only spot along the river where the Metro rail service crosses above the Anacostia. So wave hello as we move north, further into parts of the Anacostia that are simultaneously more wild, while also being some of the most tarnished by human neglect. Now as we float along, let's look around and fully take in and experience our surroundings. Minimal buildings can be seen, egrets and great blue herons, join beavers and turtles, and exploring the shorelines for food and shelter. Wetlands dot the edges of the river, taking hold next to a few bald cypress and struggling ash trees alike. Mallards and wood ducks join Canada geese in foraging around the shallows, and crew boats slip silently up and down the river in the early mornings and later hours. This is truly a serene Anacostia we are experiencing. One that is, unknowingly really, juxtaposed next to a more imperiled one. Because below the surface we float across lie decades of potentially harmful pollutants and toxins that pose a serious threat not only to the wildlife we see around us, but also to us. On this stretch of the river, on the east bank, lie some of the last reminders of the industrial past of the Anacostia. A large embayment on the river marks a hotspot of PCB contamination next to an old Pepco power plant where the pollution is expected to have originated from. PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls, are often used in products involved in power production like transformers and other components. PCBs and most other toxins are typically hydrophobic chemicals, meaning that they don't really like to dissolve in water. However, like most pollutants, these chemicals adsorb onto sediment particles and can hitch a ride into the river through things like illegal dumping, stormwater runoff, or even erosion of contaminated soils onshore into the river. Now, while these toxins aren't harmful to humans in this current state, as they're lying at the bottom of the river, they can work their way into the food chain through smaller organisms. Some of these toxins, like PCBs, can then move up the food chain and bioaccumulate in organisms at the top of the food chain, much like mercury contamination in tuna or sharks in marine environments. This is why there's a fish consumption advisory on the Anacostia, because certain fish have been found to have high concentrations of these chemicals in their bodies and will only continue to accumulate these toxins until the toxins are fully removed from the ecosystem. Fish consumption guidance can be found on the District Department of Energy and Environment website and gives protocols for how much fish is safe to eat based on things like your age, your gender, and the actual species of fish you wish to consume. These protocols can be different for both men, women, and children because these toxins can only really be passed from human to human through childbirth, putting women and children at higher risk. In the Anacostia, there are 3 fish that anglers are prohibited from eating at all. Those are striped bass, or rockfish if you're from Maryland, the American eel, and Asian carp. These fish are typically found at the top of their respective food chains and have been found to have higher concentrations of these toxins in their bodies. But how do we get to a fully fishable Anacostia again, where anglers can catch and eat their fish without fear of contamination? Currently, the district and other personally responsible parties are undertaking the Anacostia River Sediment Project, with the intention of identifying what toxics may be in the river, where they're located, and then the best method to use to remove those toxins from the river. The investigation stage of the project was completed in early 2020, with the actual cleanup expected to start in early 2021 and to take several years. Just upstream of this embayment lies Kenilworth Park and Watts Branch, one of the primary tributaries to the Anacostia in the district, and a prime location to examine the intersection of race, the environment, and their long history along the Anacostia. Ever since European settlers started moving into the watershed, minority communities who lived along the Anacostia have often borne the brunt of the effects from environmental racism. Indigenous First Peoples to the area were systematically forced off their land. Black communities were slowly pushed from the city center after the Civil War, and as the district grew, these neighborhoods became unwilling targets for industrial development projects like power plants, landfills, and major highways that only served to fracture and disproportionately increase air and water pollution in these communities. For example, the Highway 295 was forced through communities in Wards 7 and 8, and the Benning Road Trash Transfer Station was one of only a few trash transfer stations in the district, almost all placed directly in the immediate vicinity of numerous Black communities. One of the most unsettling examples of this comes from the area what is now Kenilworth Park, which on the old Kenilworth landfill used to sit. The Kenilworth landfill was operational from 1942 until 1970 and received municipal waste from throughout the district. It also operated as a burn landfill, meaning that the waste was burned on select days during the month to help keep the volume of trash down in the landfill. Unfortunately, this landfill was placed along the environmentally sensitive Anacostia and directly adjacent to several primarily Black communities like Deanwood and River Terrace. With the trash being burned several times a month, toxic smoke was prevalent in these communities, causing higher instances of asthma and other respiratory issues in these communities as opposed to other communities in the district. It also cut off access to the river for a majority of residents in Ward 7, who used to swim and play along this stretch of the river and Watts Branch. The landfill was finally closed and covered after community outcry over the tragic death of Kelvin Mock, which occurred in the landfill. Today, the site has been covered and transformed into Kenilworth Park, a broad area managed by the National Park Service as part of Anacostia Park. It still serves as a barrier between Ward 7 communities and the river and is in need of remediation due to its past use. It's through this area that Watts Branch flows. Being one of the primary tributaries to the Anacostia, Watts Branch has a long history of recreation and community love, as residents used to play and swim along the stream in the past. However, over the past decades, it's been a major source of trash and potential bacterial pollution to the Anacostia, as a high volume of stormwater can flow into the stream during storms. In fact, the area around Watts Branch is one of the most at risk for future flooding due to rising waters, due to its tidal nature, highly variable flows, and high instances of flash floods. Thankfully, to address these issues, the district has enacted strong climate and sustainability plans to address potential flood risks, as well as innovative trash reduction solutions. We at Anacostia Riverkeeper actually helped the district to install and maintain 2 bandalong litter traps along Watts Branch that help to capture most floatable trash and prevent it from entering the main stem Anacostia. Despite its past history, this is also one of the best places along the river to view wildlife. Great blue herons are semi-residents to the Anacostia, living in certain parts mostly throughout the year, with some species of egrets migrating into the Anacostia during the warmer summer months. But make sure you keep your eyes up as we move upstream, as some of our resident bald eagles like to use this stretch of the river to hunt. Along the shoreline, you can often see some of the many turtles that call the Anacostia home, from red-eared sliders sitting on tree trunks as we move upstream to eastern box turtles. Also keep an eye out for deer, fox, and beaver that have often been found foraging along the river. Beaver especially love this area of the river and can often be found swimming around in the summer. If you have a keen eye, you may be able to even spot some river otters, which also make their home along the Anacostia. Although you may need to be patient, as they are social animals amongst themselves, but less often seen out and about on the river. We are now nearing the DC-Maryland border and have almost traveled the whole length of the main stem Anacostia in DC. Kingman Island has ended just on the west bank as we move up, and you can see some of the Langston Golf Course over the trees. On the east bank of the river, Kenilworth Park continues, and you truly feel like you've been transported back in time. We are still in the city, still in the nation's capital, but no buildings can be seen, and the city noises of car horns and buses gives way to the sound of flowing water and the subtle sounds of nature. As we make the turn towards the district line, we pass the National Arboretum on the west bank of the river. The Arboretum was established in 1927 by an act of Congress and is currently managed by the United States Department of Agriculture. Just before we reach the Arboretum, we pass Hickey Run on the west bank, one of the other main tributaries to the Anacostia that flows through the Arboretum just before meeting the main stem river. Unfortunately, Hickey Run is one of the more imperiled tributaries to the Anacostia, as it receives an abundance of stormwater input and is often found to have elevated bacterial counts throughout the year. In the summer, visitors may go to the Anacostia and may also notice beautiful greenery growing along the river, looking almost something like you'd see in an old photograph of the South. Unfortunately, this pleasing greenery is an invasive vine called kudzu, also known as the plant that smothered the South. As a plant grows, it grows up trees, smothers it, eventually causing the tree to die. However, this isn't the only invasive species to the Anacostia that poses a threat to trees along the river. You may notice some large, dead trees along the river. Most of these are ash trees, which have unfortunately been killed by the emerald ash borer, an invasive beetle that makes its home in ash trees, eventually killing the tree. They have spread not just to the Anacostia, but all over the Chesapeake Bay, and are considered a major issue as ash trees are essential shade trees for cities and natural ecosystems alike, helping to reduce the heat island effect in cities and decreasing overall air and water temperatures around the river. The Arboretum itself is 446 acres and contains thousands of species of different plants from across the world. Near the center of the Arboretum are the National Capitol columns. These set of 22 Corinthian columns were once part of the U.S. Capitol and were transported here to make for one of the more recognizable areas of the Arboretum. But most interesting to the Anacostia, the Arboretum serves as the home for one of DC's resident bald eagle couples, lovingly nicknamed Mr. President and the First Lady. The pair began nesting in the Arboretum in 2014 and were some of the first bald eagles to nest in the district since the 1940s. Due to the widespread use of the pollutant DDT, which took a disastrous toll on bird populations in the region, especially bald eagles, throughout the 20th century. Today, the First Lady and Mr. President can be spotted flying around the Anacostia and D.C., squabbling with visiting ospreys, and have even been joined by more eagles along the river. There's even a live camera that people can view online, which is pointed directly at the nest and is wildly popular in the spring and summer months when young eagles are just being born. Just upstream of the Arboretum sits one of the truly hidden gems of the Anacostia, the Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens. The land that the gardens sit on were purchased by a Civil War veteran. Missing some of his native water lilies from Maine, Shaw brought some down to the Anacostia and planted them in the river, where they ended up thriving. After the years, he planted more and more species of aquatic plants until the land passed to his daughter. With talks of dredging becoming a reality, Shaw's daughter, Helen Shaw Fowler, fought to save the gardens her father built and eventually sold the land to the U.S. government in 1938 to be turned into a national park. Today, the aquatic gardens are part of the larger Anacostia Park complex and receive thousands of visitors each year, especially in the summertime when the annual Lotus Festival takes place. Around the middle of the summer each year, the thousands of lotus plants in the gardens bloom to reveal magnificent flowers that draw visitors and photographers alike from around the world. Hundreds of different aquatic plants call these gardens home, and it is said that over the years, almost 300 different species of birds have been spotted in the gardens, a popular resting spot along with the rest of the Anacostia for migrating waterfowl. We have now reached the most northerly portion of the mainstem Anacostia, next to Bladensburg, Maryland. This portion of the Anacostia lies within Maryland, as the D.C.-Maryland boundary on the river is the New York Avenue Bridge. As the upper portion of the Anacostia watershed drains parts of Montgomery and Prince George's counties, the water eventually flows into the two primary tributaries to the Anacostia, the Northwest Branch and the Northeast Branch, which then in turn meet and flow into the mainstem Anacostia just north of Bladensburg, Maryland. This portion of the river is still tidal and is one of the first spots on the river you can put in a boat to head downriver. Unfortunately, when you look at the river around Bladensburg, one of the first things you notice are the sandbars and how shallow this portion of the river is. To really explain this, we have to go all the way back to when this area was first being explored by European settlers. Tobacco was one of the leading industries in this area of the Anacostia when European settlers were first coming into the area. It was grown all throughout the watershed and then brought to Bladensburg to be put on ships and sent around the world. At this time, the Anacostia was said to be over 30 feet deep and could accommodate large trading ships, making Bladensburg a bustling trading port that at one point was the second largest port on the U.S. Atlantic coast. But all was not as good as it seemed. As tobacco farming takes a toll on local soil conditions, as old-growth forests with long, deep roots that held the soil in place were cut down and replaced by farmland tobacco plants with shallow root systems, increasing local erosion and depositing untold amounts of sediment into the river. Today, Bladensburg is one of the shallowest points along the river and can even measure as shallow as 1 to 2 feet deep in some places. This carelessness and lack of understanding concerning land use and its effect on the Anacostia would unfortunately continue into the future, with the whole length of the mainstem suffering from sediment pollution. It was only recently, with the passage of the landmark legislation like the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and the Endangered Species Act, that an increased focus on environmental health and longevity was made a priority, especially on the Anacostia. Bladensburg has a special place in local and U.S. history. Because of its use as a port, it's been witness to some of history's best stories. Bladensburg was the location where the British came to cross into the district and attacked the nation's capital during the War of 1812, in a battle commonly known as the Bladensburg Races, jokingly named because of the speed of the American forces' retreat back to Washington after losing the battle. Nearby Bladensburg is also a locally famous tributary, aptly named Dueling Creek. This was a site where many duel for honor took place, as dueling was illegal in the District of Columbia, and the creek was located just over the border in Maryland, thus making it legal. Currently, despite shallow water levels, Bladensburg is still a bustling center for river recreation, with Bladensburg Waterfront Park serving as a meeting point for kayakers, crew teams, bike trails, and many more recreation opportunities. Taking a trip downriver from Bladensburg, whether it be by boat or bike, is truly a magical experience, as this stretch of the river has only been lightly altered by human development, making it one of the few spots on the river where you can truly go back in time and experience the Anacostia as it might have looked in its natural, unaltered state. Don't be surprised if you see abundant wildlife along this stretch of the river, as bald eagles, ospreys, cormorants, and blue heron are just a few of the birds you can see, with untold amounts of other animals like beaver, bass, and deer patrolling in or around the water's edge. So it's here at Bladensburg that we unfortunately end our tour of the Anacostia River. We at Anacostia Riverkeeper and the District Department of Energy and Environment would like to thank you for joining us on the Anacostia and experiencing just a little bit of what makes this amazing river so important to DC. We encourage you to take our in-person boat tours in the summer, spring, and fall, where you can really gain a nice and unique first-hand experience of the Anacostia. Really see the birds flying overhead, experience the water on our boat as it flows by and we move upstream. And we hope you've learned a little bit about Anacostia history, DC culture, and some of the things that this river has done to help shape our home in DC, and some of the things that have really made it our river, DC's river. Its path from beautiful environmental ecosystem to one marred by industry and development, to now one on the path to resurgence and beauty. So we'd like to thank you again from the bottom of our hearts for coming out to our river and your river, for truly experiencing the Anacostia.